right, here we go. Mini lecture on the causes of the French Revolution, stage one of our French Revolution inquiry project. We're going to be talking about the estate system in France, the Enlightenment ideas versus the ideas of absolutism, and the debt France was in. So as we talk about causes of the revolution, it's important to remember what we're talking about are the different situations inside of France that are causing the people to want to rise up and overthrow their government. So right now we're setting the stage. How bad is it inside France? Well, the first thing that we're going to talk about is something called the estate system. Inside France, society was set up to be divided into three different groups. These groups are called estates. The first estate, you can see up here, is made up of members of the clergy. These are people who work for the Catholic Church. They represent 1% of the French population, and they pay no taxes. The second estate in France are members of the French nobility. These are people who have royal blood or royal lineage. They make up 2% of France's population. They're very wealthy, and they themselves pay almost no taxes. And then the third estate in France is the last estate, but it is a massive estate that is made up of every single human being inside of France who is not either a clergyman, a person who works for the church, or a French noble. Inside of this estate is 97% of the French population, and this group is going to pay almost all of the taxes in France because they are so massive. Because this group's so massive, I just want to make sure that I highlight this for you. There are basically two groups, I'm going to use the pointer, two groups inside the third estate that we'll refer to. The first group that we'll refer to most often is called the bourgeoisie. Don't worry if you can't say it or how to spell it. The bourgeoisie, though, are the wealthy, educated members of the third estate. So think lawyers, doctors, merchants. These guys need to be able to read. These guys are making a decent amount of money and are not the poorest of the poor. If you are not a member of the bourgeoisie inside the third estate, you are probably an urban worker or a peasant, somebody who is just working to survive. So, why is this considered a cause of the revolution? Let me show you. The problem with the estate system. The purpose of the estate system was to break France up into three different groups so that if the king needed to, he could call a meeting of what's known as the Estates General. The Estates General was when representatives from each estate came to a meeting with the king where issues affecting France could be discussed. Most of the time, the king ruled just how he wanted, but occasionally, in times of crisis, the Estates General would be convened and the king would ask the Estates General to vote on issues. When he would ask the Estates General to vote on issues, the way that the voting was scored was with each estate getting to cast one vote. So the first estate would cast one vote on whatever they felt the answer to the issue was. The second estate would cast one vote, hoping to answer whatever the issue the king was presenting to them. And the third estate would cast one vote. At the end of the day, there'd be three votes. Whichever side got 2 or 3 votes would be what the king did. The problem with that is based on the number of people that represent each estate. The first and second estate combined represented 3% of the French population. 3 out of every 100 French citizens was a member of the first or second estates. The third estate, 97% of the French population, also only got 1 vote. And so many times when the king will call meetings of the Estates Generals together, the first and second estate might vote together on an issue that would take advantage of the third estate. And even though the third estate was the vast majority of the French citizenry, they didn't have enough votes to outvote the first and second estate together. So the 3% was basically acting like a tyrant to the 97%. So that's a problem, and hopefully you can see why that's super unfair. Let's build on it. So cause 2 for the French Revolution are the ideas of the Enlightenment. So we've spent a lot of time in class talking about the Enlightenment, talking about writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, Voltaire, Baron de Montesquieu. And all these people are coming out with ideas that are trying to give the people in a country more power and more rights. And so as French citizens, particularly the bourgeoisie, because remember, they're the educated people, so they're the ones who are able to read and afford books, so they're the ones more familiar with the thinking of Enlightenment philosophers. As these guys come up with these ideas, they're going to see the ideas of Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau put in comparison with the system of government they're currently living under, which is the estate system. And they're going to recognize that this is a massively unfair system. It is completely and totally against the teachings of John Locke or Baron de Montesquieu to have 3% of the French population essentially being able to dictate what happens to the poorest 97% in a population. And so the Enlightenment ideas are going to directly butt heads with the ideas of divine authority, or the idea that the French king and queen system of government is the system of government because God told them that that was the best system of government. So after these Enlightenment ideas have been around, remember the French Revolution's happening in the late 1700s, so right now we're talking about the situation in the 1770s and 1780s in France. The French people are going to begin to question the legitimacy of their own government. Should this government we currently have, the king and queen, should they be the ones that we trust to be in charge of us? And when they realize that the king is continually being unfair to them over and over and over again, they start to realize that they may have to do that thing that John Locke talks about in his writings, where they might have to fight for the government to give them Enlightenment rights. They may have to overthrow their current system in favor of a new system that will grant them life, liberty, and property, or will give the government the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of religion and a separation of powers. So Enlightenment ideas are being learned by the bourgeoisie, and through the estate system, these third estate members in France are recognizing this absolute monarchy thing might be outdated and might be unfair, and it might be that we should change it. The final cause, this is the cause that's going to kind of be the straw on top, or the cherry on top is a better explanation for it. This is the cause that's going to cause France to erupt. In the 1780s, the French economy was collapsing. The heaviest taxes in France, basically the only taxes in France, were on the third estate. The third estate, many members of the third estate, were incredibly poor. We're talking about peasants, we're talking about people who work in very basic factories for barely enough money to live. And as the 1780s roll on in France, the economic situation is going to continually get worse, especially for the poorest of the poor. In the late 1780s, there are widespread crop failures. There's a disease that hits some of the crops inside France. There's a massive hailstorm which destroys huge amounts of crops inside France. And so with all of the crops, the grain being destroyed before it can be turned into bread, the price of bread is going to increase dramatically in France. And while you and I may say, okay, then people won't eat bread, not a big deal, no sandwiches, what you need to know is that in the 1780s, the main food source of the third estate was a loaf of French bread. And so as the price of bread increases every single day, it basically increases to a point where many of the third estate are going to starve to death or have to dip into their savings, if they have any, to buy enough food for that day for their family to starve or to survive. This is at the same time that the French government is in a ton of debt. And the French government is in debt for several reasons. One of the first reasons, and we should thank them for this, is that the French king and the French monarchy helped fund and helped America win its revolution against Britain in 1776 and through the early 1780s. America, being a brand new country, hadn't quite paid France back for all the help that France just gave us during the Revolution, and so that caused some struggles for the French monarchy as they couldn't just get that money that they were owed from the Americans because the Americans were busy, trying to start a brand new country. The King and Queen of France, King Louis and Marie Antoinette, were not necessarily the most in tune with their people's struggles. There were rumors that they were throwing these massive, incredible banquets and parties all over France at the same time that their people were starving. And so the regular French people kind of started to get upset, thinking about, my king and queen are eating the fanciest food ever and inviting hundreds and hundreds of rich people over for fancy dinner parties, while me and you are on the street barely able to afford bread, and thinking about killing the neighbor's cat and roasting it over an open fire so that we can eat tonight. So there's a pretty big difference between what the government's doing and what the people are doing, and it's going to create resentment between the people and their government. Finally, the last thing is that European banks and other countries started to realize that France wasn't making their payments back to the banks when they lend France money. And that was partially because the French economy was collapsing because of the hailstorm, And that was partially because of the king and the queen throwing lavish parties, and partially because of America not paying France back as in a timely as a fashion as the French would hope. And when the European banks stopped lending France money, the French people and the French government stopped having a way to pay their employees, stopped having a way to pay for some reduced prices of bread. And suddenly it's going to create a terrible system in France. And so the very last thing that I want you to think about is this quote here at the bottom. When the people began to starve, they looked to the king to help provide them food. When it was found out that he did not have the money to feed his people, the people became very angry at him. As you all know, when you're hungry, you're much quicker to get angry than if you're not hungry. And so imagine an entire country starving to death and think about how angry the mob of people there might be. So all these three things are going to play into each other to create a situation, which we'll talk about next time, where boom, a revolution begins in France and we're going to change the way the government functions.